This is Rummy's Corner. Good evening, boxing fans, and welcome back to part 3 of the Top 10 by Decade scoring experiment. In part 1, we examined the heavyweight division. In part 2, we went through the cruiserweight division. And today, in part 3, we're going to take a look at the light heavyweight division, where we will be utilizing Ring Magazine's rich archive of historical rankings in order to try and objectively determine the top 10 light heavyweight boxers from each decade. Ring Magazine began doing annual rankings for the light heavyweight division back in 1924. So for our purposes here, we're going to start with the first full decade with a complete data set of rankings, the 1930s. At the conclusion of 1930, these were the top-rated light heavyweights according to Ring Magazine. Maxie Rosenblum was champion, so he'll get 10 points for being the top name on the list. His number 1 contender was Jimmy Slattery, so he gets 9 points. And we continue allocating points in this fashion, and the last name to receive 1 point is the number 9 rated contender, Al Gainer. Note that George Nichols is the 11th name on the list, and he receives nothing. Some years Ring has 11 names listed, other years it's only 10. But for our purposes here, we're only concerned with the top 10 names on the list. If we go through and do this for every year from 1930 through 1939, our final results would look like this. John Henry Lewis tops the list with 61 points. And he edged out Maxie Rosenblum with 58 points. Those two boxers were consistently ranked near the top for large chunks of the 1930s, and they were rewarded accordingly under this scoring criteria. Rosenblum officially holds 2 victories over Lewis, both in non-title bouts, and I mention this as a reminder that these rankings don't take head-to-head results into account. Instead, it's designed to acknowledge longevity within a single weight class over the course of a very specific time interval. Moving on to the 1940s, Gus Lesnovich finished first with 85 points. Freddie Mills had 45, and then Archie Moore had 39 points. The 1940s results are always going to show an inherent bias towards the guys who were champion when the titles were frozen during World War II. With Lesnovich finishing head and shoulders above the rest here, that inherent bias becomes far more pronounced in the light heavyweight division than it was with Joe Louis in the heavyweight division. That being said, this was the second consecutive decade where Lesnovich finished in the top 10 among light heavyweights. It's also worth noting that Ezzard Charles placed 5th with 24 points, and I'll have more to say about him later. Then looking at the 1950s, we have Archie Moore, the old Mongoose, amassing an incredible 97 points. With 100 points being the most that one can theoretically reach in any given decade, this is a tremendous total for the old Mongoose. Archie's extraordinary score is the best score of any boxer from any weight class we've covered thus far. Harold Johnson scored an impressive 60 points, finishing second, and third place is Joey Maxim with an impressive 50-point total in his own right. This is the first decade where 3 or more light heavyweights scored 50 points. But the 1950s light heavyweight division was thoroughly dominated by Archie Moore. Even though Moore had spent a good deal of time in the 50s campaigning as a heavyweight, he still regularly defended his light heavyweight world championship. I also want to mention here that Floyd Patterson finished 8th, and this is the first time we've come across a boxer who is considered top 10 in 2 different weight classes during the same decade, because Patterson also finished in the top 10 heavyweights from the 1950s. In the 1960s, there was a tie for the top score. Harold Johnson and Eddie Cotton both had 44 points. Not to be confused with Eddie Cotton, the referee. And there was also a tie for third at 38 points between Peralta and Tiger. Bob Foster was very close to them with 36 points. So after the 1950s, we had 3 light heavyweights with 50 or more, and nobody did that here in the 60s. There are some solid names on this list, but none of them were considered among the very best throughout the entirety of the 1960s. At the bottom of this list, we have Archie Moore again, just barely making the list. This marks the 3rd consecutive decade where the old Mongoose was considered a top 10 light heavyweight, and it's the first boxer we've come across that has ever been included in the top 10 in 3 consecutive decades from the same weight class, and I think that's very significant. Moving on to the 1970s, we had another tie for first place. Victor Emilio Galindez and John Conte. They both scored 58 points. And then in a distant third, we have Bob Foster with 40 points. And the main difference separating these guys is that Galindez and Conte were both considered among the very best for longer campaigns during the 70s, even though Foster had a more dominant stretch, which actually began in the late 60s. So in a sense, Foster is suffering from the Larry Holmes syndrome here, where a fighter's prime years stretch across 2 decades. In the case of Bob Foster in this instance, he finished as a top 10 light heavyweight in both of those decades. On to the 1980s, it's sort of a similar situation here to what we had in the 1960s. No one topped the 50-point barrier, and Michael Spinks led the way with 46 points. Then we have Marvin Johnson and Dwight Muhammad Cowie. There's a lot of talent on this list, but none of these boxers had a stretch of success here that went beyond 5 years. A lot of these guys wound up jumping up in weight, either to the new cruiserweight division or even straight to the heavyweight division like Spinks did. As far as Michael Spinks goes, we're seeing the same thing here from him in the 80s that we just saw with Floyd Patterson from the 50s. Both of them finished top 10 from different weight classes in the same decade. So in that context, it's a stronger showing for Spinks than his 46-point total might otherwise indicate. Looking at the 1990s, Virgil Hill topped the list with a very impressive 73 points. His strong showing was driven by the fact that Ring Magazine considered him to be a top 3 light heavyweight for 8 consecutive years. Prince Charles was second, and then you have Roy Jones edging out Dariusz Michalczewski. Jones and Michalczewski both hold victories over Hill, but they didn't come along until later in the decade, whereas Hill was consistently considered among the best of the weight class during the 90s. This again illustrates the point that the final results being rendered are independent of head-to-head outcomes. But in the context of what we are looking for, longevity within a weight class over a specific time interval, Hill has deservedly placed higher than his 2 conquerors. On to the double O's. It was a very strong showing for Antonio Tarver, who topped the list with 74 points. Roy Jones was also very impressive with 61 points, and 52 points for Glenn Johnson marks this as the first time since the 50s where 3 or more light heavyweights scored at least 50 points. And I think that speaks to the fact that we had some real talent competing at light heavyweight during this time. And for Tarver, he was considered top 10 material throughout the entire decade, and most of that time he was considered among the top 3. So these are some impressive totals for Tarver. And now, even though the current decade is not yet complete, through the end of 2017, the list looks like this. Bernard Hopkins is on top with 53 points. And then ironically, we have Sergey Kovalev and Adonis Stevenson tied for second with 46 points. We still have to wait and see how the rest of the decade plays out, but it looks like it's a 2-man race between Kovalev and Stevenson. And while I still doubt these two will ever square off, for the scoring here, I think it boils down to how they are both perceived at the conclusion of 2018 and 2019. But either way, it's an impressive showing for Bernard, this being the second consecutive decade he appeared as a top 10 light heavyweight, especially when you consider that Bernard is usually best known for what he achieved at middleweight. And speaking of boxers who appeared as top 10 light heavyweights in more than one decade, Hopkins was just one of 10 boxers who qualified. Archie Moore is the standout among the standouts. The old Mongoose finished in the top 10 during the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. It's simply a mind-boggling result for the old Mongoose. And just as mind-boggling was his 97-point total from the 1950s. That, of course, was the most dominant decade for a light heavyweight under our scoring criteria. And indeed, it was the most dominant decade for any boxer in any weight class we've come across so far. Then we have Lesnevich with 85 points, but the 1940s rankings are somewhat skewed as a result of the titles being frozen during the war. Antonio Tarver is next with 74 points in the double O's. Virgil Hill's right behind him with 73 points in the 90s. Then a tie between 1930s John Henry Lewis and Roy Jones Jr. from the 2000s. Harold Johnson from the 50s came in 7th. And then we close out with a three-way tie between Galindez and Conte from the 70s and Maxie Rosenblum from the 30s. Now, if we add up all the numbers from light heavyweights who finished in the top 10 in any decade since the 1930s, we get a final result that looks like this. Not surprisingly, the old Mongoose had the best score here, and by a considerable margin as well. Tarver and Lewis made the top 10 here, based exclusively on the strength from what they did in a single decade. Prince Charles and Chad Dawson had both qualified as top 10 in multiple decades, but they still finished with lower totals than what Tarver did in the double O's and what Lewis did in the 30s. Looking at this list, the one name missing that really jumps out is the Cincinnati Cobra, Ezzard Charles, because he's viewed by many as the greatest light heavyweight of all time. Ezzard was probably never going to do very well under this scoring criteria in any case, because he didn't compete as a light heavyweight for very long. But even still, he defeated a slew of awesome light heavyweights from a really tough era during that time, including 3 victories against the old Mongoose himself. But untimely circumstances, not limited to World War II, and some bad luck, not limited to the politics of the time, these things prevented Charles from ever getting a shot at Gus Lesnevich. And before that, he even had a difficult time landing a bout with then middleweight champion Tony Zale. So Charles moved up, and he's best known, of course, for his time as heavyweight champion, but the reality is, in a head-to-head sense, Ezzard Charles might well have been the greatest light heavyweight of all time. But in terms of tracking perceived dominance within a given weight class over a period of specific time intervals, I think this final list paints an interesting picture, notwithstanding the inherent World War II bias and the fact that there were a few surprises here, especially with some of the ordering. But that's why we do the experiment. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Please stay tuned for part 4 of the Top 10 by Decade series in the near future, where we're going to take a look at the super middleweight division. Until then, have a great night.